Here on KGRA Radio, welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. We now move on to part 6 of the remarkable series of discussions that I have been having with JFK assassination researcher Phillip Lavelle. Phillip's knowledge of the assassination of President Kennedy is quite comprehensive, and although he's never published any of his research, he has conducted a lot of interviews, done a great deal of work on this subject. He knows this field as well as anyone, it seems to me. We got together for a very, very long conversation a couple of months ago, and this is the result. The first 5 parts have already been released. Part 1 provided deep background on Lee Harvey Oswald. Part 2 covered the summer of 1963 and the day of the assassination itself, on November 22nd, 1963, in which it was quite obvious, by the way, that Oswald was totally set up. Part 3 covered the incredible fight, unknown, at least to me, a lot of this was unknown, over the president's body. Part 4 talked about the travesty of the autopsy itself, where it was very obvious that President Kennedy was hit by several bullets, quite a few bullets, and that this fact was completely covered up. Part 5 deals mainly with the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby. You know, Oswald clearly knew he was in trouble, although he doesn't seem to have known that someone had been impersonating him for some time. He was clearly set up as a patsy, which is the very word he used to describe himself. Now we are up to part 6, and here Phillip and I move the conversation to the evident manipulation of the Zapruder film, which of course has constituted the main visual evidence that people have used to analyze the assassination. But Phillip shows that this film was modified, changed in important ways. And then we also had a long discussion of President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And man, that can only be described as a conversation about a violent psychopath. Did you know that LBJ had his own personal hitman? Yep, he did. Lots more there. Now, what's interesting is that this conversation you're about to hear is the final part of what was an initial 4.5-hour-long discussion that we had while we met by chance last October. It was really incredible. 2 of the previous segments of this interview actually were recorded after the fact in order for us to give a little bit more detail about this. But what you're about to hear is the actual final part of our original conversation. Now, of course, Phillip and I will still have more to cover after this. I'm really hoping to get that nailed down, including anything we have that we left out on the infamous Warren Commission. We talk a little bit about that here, but we really have a lot more to discuss clearly in the future, and more on the aftermath in general, including the many mysterious deaths of connected individuals to the assassination, and even I'd like to talk about the Jim Garrison trial itself. So, and, you know, any more discussion that comes up, I think we really want to cover. But that's for later. For now, join me and Phillip Lavelle for part 6 of the JFK Sessions, LBJ the Psychopath.
Roger Stone, do you know who he is? He's in the political scene. He was,
sure.
Do you know who Karl Rove is?
Yes, of course.
He's sort of he's a Karl Rove of the Nixon era, and a political consultant, and he wrote a book that said LBJ did it, and with all of his top-level contacts over the years. He used to personally brief Richard Nixon at his New York apartment on a daily basis or a weekly basis, where he would see him all the time on what's going on in the political world and all that. So his contacts were at the very top of the Republican world and all that. He said that actually Arlen Specter admitted
Senator,
to him,
Pennsylvania,
the inventor of the magic bullet.
Yes, of course.
Yes, the inventor of the magic bullet there.
Right.
Even admitted to him that the Zapruder film was altered. And what they have done is many of the top Hollywood people in the last 3 to 4 years behind the scenes at the highest level of the Hollywood world have looked at it and have come out and said it's definitely been altered, and this patch in the back of JFK's head in some of these frames. He said it's crude. It's probably the best you could do even at that time under short notice that they were able to do. It said there's a patch here and there's several frames taken out. You can tell.
Let's explain. In reality, the vehicle stopped or nearly stopped for a certain period of time while the bullets were flying at the president. But you said by that night, that film was in Rochester, New York, at Eastman Kodak, in a secure facility that they had there.
In the skunk works that they know from a very honest, straightforward, the guy that worked in the lab there for many years he would brief the president on U-2 stuff and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's right. They analyzed a lot of the U-2 photographs and so forth.
The Warren Commission in the report gives this outline of where the Zapruder film went that night. It went here, then it went there, and then that's it. This guy says, no, I had it Friday night. It was in my stuff. I was supposed to give we're supposed to blow up the frames, look at the whole thing, get it all set on these briefing boards of the very important frame showing the shots. And I do these briefing boards for, the head of the CIA and all that stuff. I did 6 briefing boards. I did all the stuff that I was supposed to do. We looked at the film, and when he said the film that I see of the Zapruder film that's there today, that's not what I saw that night. There was more head explosion. It went on for several frames, not just the one frame that it's in there. So he says, all I know is what I did and where it went. And it was in Rochester, New York on Friday night where it was not supposed to be. So it went somewhere after he did his stuff. And he says, the briefing boards that you did, here's a photograph of them that's in the archives there. He says, are these the ones that you did? He said, no, they aren't the ones. The ones that I did, I never do it this way. I always, have the boards in a different way. He says, they aren't mine. So they are someone else's boards that did them. They had it in plan to have someone else do it.
What they did is they removed the paws of the vehicle, and they patched up as much as they could at that time the worst of the explosion of the back of the president's head. The driver and the passenger, the Secret Service guys, appear to turn really quick. I mean, really quick. If you ever look at it all the time, they're turning their heads quick, and JFK moves real fast on that thing because they took out some frames. So that sped up stuff. They also took out some frames they're not quite sure that they may have taken out some frames. There may have been a bullet strike of that sign as well. One of the bullets may have hit that sign, and they're thinking there may have been a flash or something, and they took out a sign there. If you ever see the Zapruder film, you see it, because Zapruder said he was filming it from the turn all the way down, when it turned on from Houston on. You'll look at it, it suddenly just appears right there. You're talking about the
road
billboard
coming down. Yeah, and it's back up from the billboard, but it suddenly appears. It's like, once you know to look for that, it's like,
that came up.
Boy, that is odd.
You got to wonder why they didn't just disappear the Zapruder film at all. Was it known immediately that it was shot?
Yeah, it sort of got out there, and there was a copy made in Dallas, or there was some. Yeah, it was out there. That's the thing.
So they couldn't.
It was out there.
They couldn't pretend it didn't exist. So they had to manipulate it to the.
Yep. Beverly Oliver, who is a well-known person in the JFK community, she is the opposite view of Zapruder, who is up on the pedestal here.
There's another side of the street.
She's over on that other grassy part that's in the middle over there.
Is it to the left of the president's motorcade?
Right.
On the other side of the street.
Where there's very few people. The reason there's very few people...
They were filmed running, those folks, were they not?
There were some of them that...
There was a family.
there was some people film run because they wanted to see the president up at the corner of Houston, then to catch him back again after he makes the turn, they would run down and see him there. There was very few people on there because, as a researcher said, he was down there and spoke to some nuns that brought a whole bunch of students there that were going to watch, and guys claiming to be Secret Service was clearing that entire other side of the grassy part. That's why there's so few people there, because the cops were told, keep them off of this area here, because that's where they knew bullets would be coming, or they were told that's really the way it looks, because there's hardly any over there. There's about, you see a spattering of 14 or 15 people, but some of them just sort of, started to run after they got a glimpse of JFK up here at this turn, and then they went down. Beverly Oliver, you can see her in the Zapruder thing. She's like this. There's only one thing that she can have.
Her hands up to her chin.
A movie camera.
Oh, movie camera.
That she was going like this from the Texas School Book Depository, filming the whole thing just like that. Exactly what you would want if you wanted to see what had happened, showing the grassy knoll. What happened to her film? Well, the Warren Commission never mentioned a word of it. No one, her word. It's like she didn't exist. But someone knew who she was. She says, I knew a cop that knew I was there, and he said something to me, and all I know is on Monday of the assassination, they show up to where I was working and said, we understand you have a film of stuff. Yes, I did do it. I haven't developed it. We have to get this for our investigation. It was FBI guys. We will get the film back to you in 10 days. And 55 years have gone by. But
she's not alive anymore.
Yes, she is. She's alive, and she's in Dallas every year. She went underground for years and years.
Yeah, scared out of her mind.
Not scared out of her mind.
Now, here's the thing. So she filmed it. Was she seeing it as it happened, and did she provide a different? Did she provide testimony about what she saw?
Oh no, she once that happened, she disappeared. Once she
got
heard,
out of town. She
had heard. Yeah, she was actually she ended up marrying a mobster type guy.
Got to get protection from somewhere.
Yeah. Well, she worked at Jack Ruby's competitor and was a singer and all that, and she knew Jack Ruby. Part of her story is, she's 17 and she's grown up 17, and she goes over,
as a matter of speaking,
a few days before, or about 2 or 3 weeks before, she says Jack Ruby's in there and says, I want to introduce you to someone. This is Lee Oswald of the CIA. And introduces, she remember, that's part of her stuff. Now, she says this years later.
Who's ever introduced as being in the CIA,
which is very very interesting. That's what it was a very interesting thing.
Like,
whether
I'm Lee
Ruby
Oswald,
was
super
trying
spy. Like, you just don't.
No, he didn't say it. Ruby introduced him as Lee Oswald of the CIA.
I see. How very odd.
Which is very, very odd.
Can I jump to a couple of other things here before I forget? So earlier we talked about Hoover,
correct,
writing a very unwelcome letter to LBJ about another Lee Oswald.
Right? The Oswald impersonator.
The Oswald impersonator.
Yeah, this was a phone transcript of the phone call at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Now, Hoover hated the Kennedys as much as any living person in the world.
Correct.
But he was still head of the FBI, and he was still a competitor to CIA, and he's still doing his own investigation, and he's got this information, gives it to Johnson, who's not happy, and in 87, a memo surfaced. Hoover's dead by then, of course, long time. A memo surfaced of a memo by Hoover. I think it was from a day or two after this, maybe November 24th. You know what I'm getting to?
Yep.
Of his meeting with a George Bush of the CIA. And it was all in matters pertaining to the Kennedy assassination. I cannot remember all of these details, but he wrote this down. And George Bush was vice president at the time. This was a very brief little flurry in the media. And Bush's people said, well, obviously it wasn't this George Bush. Had to be a different George Bush. And it turns out there was another man named George Bush who worked for the CIA at the time, who was alive in 1987 and was found by a journalist, and he was discovered to be a very low-level CIA person who would never had an opportunity to meet with Hoover. Meanwhile, our George Bush, future President George Bush, who was in Dallas at the time, who was rumored, maybe proven to have been involved in the Bay of Pigs operation, donating even a couple of boats to the cause, one of which was named the Barbara, I believe, is now meeting with Hoover in D.C. for what? I'm just going to say maybe to put Hoover in his place. That's my guess. To let Hoover know, don't get out of line. Yes or no?
I would say you've got some of the stuff correct. I believe the memo that you're talking to refers, I don't think to a meeting between Hoover and him, but it's from Hoover stating George Bush of the CIA. And this was the memo was dated November 29th, 1963.
Okay, so
November
a week later.
29th, 1963.
All right, so what's that memo about? What's the meaning of it?
It had something. George Bush had made a report on November 22nd after the assassination that said that he knew of someone named Neil something that had threatened the president something.
Do we know for a fact this is George Bush, future president?
Oh, he denies it, just like you said.
Yeah, right.
And he never, to this day, he does not, because he testified under oath when he was going to become the CIA director in '76, I believe. Have you ever worked for the CIA ever before? No. And he said no.
Of course, right.
But he was the family oil biz, Zapata Oil, had all sorts of CIA connections, and George Bush's could not answer where he was on November 22nd, like most people can. I spoke to the definitive author that has looked into the George Bush aspect. He wrote Talbot, and because there's a photo of someone that looks like George Bush in Dealey Plaza on November the 22nd.
Okay.
It does look like him, and this guy says, I cannot confirm it was him. I cannot confirm he was in Dallas at the time of the shooting. His plane may have come in that day or something, and he was there, but it's odd about why Bush couldn't explain where he was. It's odd that he wrote and made this report about someone threatening the president down in Houston or something. It was just things that didn't make sense, and he was trying to cover himself and put himself somewhere where he wanted to make sure there was a record, or something just doesn't smell right.
Right.
Yeah.
So the letter by Hoover from the 29th.
Yeah, that's a memo.
Right. I don't remember what it says, and I guess I don't remember the contents of. So you're saying Bush did not meet with Hoover?
No, that I don't think said that he met with them. It's a reference about George Bush that he contacted George Bush of the CIA about something that had to do
with the assassination.
Yeah, right.
I know that.
Yep. The big thing about the memo is that George Bush was with the CIA even way back then, or doing work for them, and he lied about it, and he's denying it, and he has a suspicious whereabouts of where he was on the 22nd and is trying to distance himself from the whole thing. My personal thought is he was in a loop, a CIA loop, where he probably had a good idea what was going down. And he ended up going
he was
down.
Powerful even then. And there's, I mean, anything else you want to get into? But I'll just ask you now, do you have a theory on who was really the number one behind it? Was it LBJ, or was it somewhere up in the CIA, even someone like Dulles, who was out of power at the time officially, but still influential? James Angleton, I've heard his name. He was counterintelligence at CIA. Any other suspects? Who do you think? What's your theory as to what was behind the Kennedy assassination?
Roger Stone is of the belief, and there are people that Johnson was the linchpin that did a lot of the planning, was even micromanaging some of the.
But there were so many motivations. You got motivations within the CIA, motivations within the Pentagon, motivations even from the mafia. I remember reading the book on Sam Giancana called Double Cross. That was interesting. They really try to say the mafia was behind a lot of it. I find that a little bit of a stretch, but there's definite mafia, big-time mafia connections there.
There was.
Everyone wanted Kennedy dead.
That's it. I think that it's as far as who made the final decision that we're going to go and all that. But I believe this was in the planning for quite a while, especially probably all of '63, and a couple of probably high-level military people with a couple of rogue operators within the CIA, which may have been under the direction of Dulles, who still, he was fired, but he was still very much
powerful.
In power. There was a decision that he was going to go, and there had to be some pretty good planning that was in place, with Johnson very much involved, very much involved in it right from the start, knew what was going
down. Johnson hated Kennedy as well. Like, none of these people got along with Kennedy.
Johnson was under extreme fire at that time. There was an investigation going in.
When he was vice president?
Yes.
For what purpose? I mean, everyone knew he was corrupt.
Bobby Baker was his henchman in the Senate, a guy that was behind a bunch of the payoffs of. LBJ was getting so many payoffs from so many people that he just couldn't keep it straight. And the guy behind it was this Bobby Baker. They were moving in on him. JFK's secretary, Mrs. Lincoln, says that JFK told her that they were going to drop LBJ from the ticket.
Oh, for the upcoming election.
Bobby was secretly behind a bunch of this stuff to go and get LBJ, who they believed was a totally corrupt guy that blackmailed himself onto the ticket with a bunch of Hoover-related documents that he handed over to the Kennedys.
Blackmail of the Kennedys.
And said, look, you were going to pick this other guy that they thought, I forget, it was the senator from Connecticut or something. Suddenly, everything changed. It's LBJ, and they'll say it's to get Texas, and he essentially
bring out the cemetery vote
on him. Bobby Baker is one of the one and says that JFK is never going to live for a second term, knowing the boss that he has. So there was JFK. There was a Time magazine big spread that was supposed to come out November the 29th in their edition about all these investigations involving Johnson, and things were starting to close in on him, and that's why
I didn't know this.
Yes, this is it's well documented.
I'm sure he is.
Yeah, very is, and he had he was having to move quick, and he did. All that ended on November the 22nd.
Who do you think would have been involved running the actual operation? I can't imagine Johnson would be micromanaging that, or would he? Maybe, right? Who could have done it?
They think there was a. Roger Stone believes there's much micromanaging in that Johnson's personal hitman, Mac Wallace, was up there in the book depository.
Johnson had a personal hitman?
Yes, the guy that did all of his dirt. His last killing was in '61. Bobby Baker, in a affidavit in court in 1984,
yes,
when he was under all sorts of fire, and in order to, he was talking about all of the murders that he knew. He made an affidavit of, these are the 8 people that I know that Lyndon Johnson was involved in killing. And he went with one. About number 3 or 4 was his sister.
Johnson
sister? Killed his sister. A drunken, alcoholic, loudmouth. That's not disputed. Some inspector in some department that had a whole bunch of stuff on Johnson that they thought was going down. He was riddled with bullets that they, and this is in 1961, where they ruled it a suicide in the corrupt Dallas system.
True criminal psychopath.
They finally got just to go these 8. It goes 1 through 8. Number 8, John F. Kennedy. That's the thing that he knows that Johnson was involved with those murders. They exhumed the body of this guy that they said it was a suicide, and they ruled it a homicide. On this, he was shot, and that was supposedly Mac Wallace was his guy. And the one of the killings, it wasn't the sister, may have been the boyfriend of Johnson's sister. That Johnson was hired his lawyer for Mac Wallace. This is I forget what this is in the early 50s. Johnson is holed up in the hotel across the street watching this whole trial, knows the judge really well, gets the right judge. Mac Wallace gets convicted of first-degree
Mac Wallace
murder.
Is the boyfriend of his sister.
Mac Wallace is Johnson's personal hitman.
Oh, I see. Sorry, so go on.
Yep.
So Wallace is convicted?
Yep. Of first-degree murder, and he is sentenced to 5 years probation. Spends no time in jail. This is like well established. The stuff about Johnson is so bad that, and it's kept, like the UFO topic, completely under wraps. All of the authors that do books on Johnson, they all know you're just not allowed to touch the topic.
Robert Caro did that massive study of Johnson, and I mean, there's a lot of corruption in there, and but this stuff doesn't come out.
It doesn't,
not even a little bit, I don't think.
Barr McClellan is the father of Scott McClellan, who used to be the White House press secretary for George W. Bush.
Okay.
And Barr McClellan was one of Johnson's lawyers and started working for the Johnson big firm that all of the henchmen were associated with. And the lawyers inside that firm, as Barr got to be a partner, and many years later, and they were open to him, that it's well known around here that Johnson did in JFK, and Mac Wallace was involved in it and stuff with that. But again, I'm not fully bought on that Johnson was the main guy doing the planning and actively doing a lot of the stuff. He had much help. He had to get, the military was totally on board, especially with this phony autopsy.
Let's take a quick break. I'm Richard Dolan here with JFK assassination researcher Phillip Lavelle on KGRA Radio. Welcome back to my interview with JFK researcher Phillip Lavelle as we continue our discussion on the murderous background of President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Remember Operation North Woods, which lands on Kennedy's desk, 1962. The guy who was behind that was named Lemnitz. He was in the Joint Chiefs. Arthur I can't remember his first name. High-level general. comes up with this idea of basically doing a 9/11, but in 1962 blaming Cuba for any number of different attacks that they envisioned. Kennedy says, no, not going to do this. Lemnitz just struck me as a guy who was out of his mind, like crazy with this idea that we could just do anything and get away with it. Maybe he wasn't on board, but maybe he was, or there's certainly other guys that were just like that.
Curtis LeMay was one of the guys back then.
Hated Kennedy.
Yeah, hated Kennedy.
I heard a story at a conference. Woman who comes from the old families, like powerful families, D.C., early 1960s, was at a party, and LeMay said, a toast to the president couldn't have happened to a nicer guy, couldn't have happened to a better guy. And I think she said that they said something like, we got him, like some statement like that. And I think she attributed that to LeMay, if I'm not mistaken.
That probably would be correct. No one can pin down for sure whether LeMay ended up getting in the autopsy room. If he was in town, he would have been, because this was a crowning thing for him to have been there. They haven't pinned that down.
He was probably the most prestigious Air Force general in the country at the time.
Right. Yeah,
I would think.
He was all for, they wanted to, you know about Operation Northwoods, right? Yeah. The military wanted JFK to do a first strike nuclear attack on the Soviet Union in '63. That is what they wanted and came down. That's in documents that came out. JFK reportedly came out of the room with those guys and said, these guys are nuts.
Well, totally. I mean, he knew they were nuts in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of '62. And in early '63, he comes up with the nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviets, exactly the opposite of what these... and what people sometimes forget is that in the late 50s, early 60s, the U.S. and the Soviets were detonating one after the next of these massive thermonuclear hydrogen bombs all over the world. Right. I mean, it's unbelievable, out of control situation, and hundreds and hundreds, like every year. And so then Kennedy signs this test ban treaty to stop this, and that could not have gone down well in certain quarters of the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex.
Right. To wrap up, there's a guy named Doug Horn that was in charge of the Assassinations Record Review Board. Was formed because of the JFK movie that caused an uproar
Oliver Stone,
with a lot of people, and so the idea was they were going to at least document all of the stuff they could for the assassination, but specifically writing in the bill that there could be no further investigation of the murder, and no one could be held accountable. They could just document for the record, and they had the power to go get documents and depose people
without prosecution.
Right, without prosecution. They're deposing it
doing an amnesty
for the record.
Basically.
Yeah, for the record. So that's the way they were able to get many of the depositions on and he was able to look at all of the stuff that went on Friday night with all of the documents and piece together everything that had happened, and to discover that the autopsy doctor had not done an autopsy for a minimum of 10 years, and of course it was known, that was admitted, had never done an autopsy involving a gunshot wound ever before. And that was the person who was in charge of the most important autopsy of the 20th century.
Yeah.
They will ask him to talk. How many autopsies did you do at Bethesda? None. Okay.
Amazing.
How long were you there? Well, I was there for 9.5 years. So it's fair that you didn't do an autopsy in 9.5 years. Do you know when you did an autopsy before that? No. When this guy had done an autopsy before that was in charge of the most important autopsy of the century is unknown.
Well, it begs the question, obviously, who was directing his autopsy. Because he wasn't doing it. Someone else was.
That's right.
And he was just there to be in the room.
Yeah, and one of the doctors that got that was subpoenaed to the Garrison trial, he surprisingly told the truth on the stand. He was the one that, which was all that was suppressed. It was, he said there was a bullet wound in the back. We put our fingers in and probed. It only went up to here, the bullet wound, so it didn't go through, which means there's no magic bullet then, based on sworn tesmoony.
I guess we should explain what the magic bullet was. I mean, when Kennedy was in the hospital, there was a bullet, a perfect bullet, a virtually pristine bullet found on the stretcher next to his body, correct?
Not next to his body.
Oh.
It was found on a stretcher that the guy who found it said it was not on either Conley's or JFK's stretcher. It was just on a stretcher there. Now there was,
and this was the third bullet. So the official theory is that 2 bullets killed the president, but then you have to account for John Connally, governor of Texas, who was in the car with Kennedy, his wound to his arm, and the theory was, of course, this was portrayed rather nicely in the movie JFK. I have to say, this bullet. There's one bullet that accounts for the president's head, and I think one for the throat.
No, there was the missed bullet that hit the curb, flew up, and some of the shrapnel or some of the flying cement hit James Tague in the cheek. And
that was recovered.
Cheek. That bullet was never recovered, but it was a documented missed shot. And if there's only 3 shots, that means the 2 remaining shots had to do all of the damage to JFK and Connally.
It was the one that went supposedly through his neck, right?
Came out,
and then hit Connally, but it had to do all of these bizarre turns to actually hit Connally and to ricochet through his arm and actually breaking a number of the bones, I believe. He suffered.
It broke bones in the wrist. It broke ribs. It blew out.
This is the magic bullet.
Blew out, this is the bullet. Went in the wrist and then went in the thigh, and actually was left there, and then
presumably Connally was hit by more than one bullet.
Out. He was.
Obviously, right?
Yeah, he was hit by 2. So that's why.
And so this is the bullet found in perfect condition.
In perfect condition,
it had been
matched
fired
up perfectly with the Carcano. It was fired from the Carcano.
It had
at some point, probably into cotton wadding.
Yeah, exactly. Because any bullet that impacts any target is going to suffer a tremendous amount of compression and damage. This one suffered none, essentially.
As Dr. Weck said, the Warren Commission took tests of just firing into a cadaver's wrist, and just so that didn't go through anyone else, but just into the wrist, and it was badly misshapen. I mean, badly misshapen, just hitting the wrist bone.
So you have a piece of planted evidence used by the Warren Commission, even beyond the most generous terms of idiocy you can imagine, and this even exceeds that. I mean, it's just incredible.
And how that come into being was astonishing, because supposedly this was the biggest investigation, interviewing everyone, getting all of these witnesses, getting all of the evidence, interviewed 25,000 people. This is the stuff that was being put out. Yet they didn't contact the guy who got hit in the cheek with the bullet that hit the curb.
Bullet.
He read in the newspaper in June of '64, the Warren Commission is wrapping up, and they have it nailed down to 3 shots and 3 hits, meaning Conley got hit with a bullet, and he says, I was on the front page of the Dallas Morning News on the next day after the assassination. They have a photograph of the actual curb. I was hit. I gave a report to the police. No one's ever contacted me.
And this got to the Warren Commission, and they had to change things.
Yeah, he contacts the Attorney General of Texas and says, "What's going on here?" And he sends the clippings to them about this, and the Attorney General sends it to the Warren Commission, and they say, "Shit."
Right. Enter Arlen Specter?
Yeah, enter Arlen Specter. Now they've got to invent some way, now that this third bullet,
because
one bullet is missed.
If you have more than 3 bullets, you have more than one shooter.
Yeah,
that's the key. So you've got to keep it to 3 bullets.
Yep.
But you've already lost one because that damn witness came out, and so now you have to have 2 bullets doing all of this damage.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
And since
the mental gymnastics that they put the whole world through for this.
And this thorough investigation included getting the dental x-rays of Jack Ruby's mother.
Why would that be even remotely relevant?
As Jim Garrison said, it would not have even have been germane if Jack Ruby had bitten Lee Oswald to death. He says
Exactly.
He says it would not. Yeah, that's the way it was. That's the kind of stuff they were going out interviewing Lee Oswald's 2nd grade teacher. The actual JFK's personal physician, Dr. Berkeley, was an admiral and his personal physician. He was a witness in the motorcade. He was the only doctor that was in Parkland Hospital and in the autopsy room. Of course, we have a dispute between what the Parkland doctors are saying and a dispute between what the autopsy doctors are saying. So he's the only one that was in both. He was the doctor who signed the death certificate. He was the doctor.
Who is he now?
Dr. Berkeley is the personal physician of JFK.
I see.
That they have. He also was in charge of maintaining the medical evidence in his possession after the investigation for the Kennedy family, which included the brain of JFK, bullet fragments, bone fragments, the autopsy stuff, everything. He's in charge of all of this. He's a witness to it, Dr. Berkeley.
And his conclusion, what was his statement on this?
In 1975, when the investigation was going to be reopened, he wrote, his lawyer contacted Richard Sprague, who was going to be the head of the investigation, who was going to run the assassination like a murder investigation, the way it should have been done.
Yes.
Berkeley's lawyer says, my client, Dr. Berkeley, has never been interviewed by anyone and has information which will indicate there was more than one shooter.
The Warren Commission never interviewed him.
And the second investigation decided to follow that same plan.
Right, of course, because we're talking 1977.
Well, 75, the church hearing got it started. And
right.
It was on, I think the report came out in 78 or 9.
So he was interviewed by the House investigation.
He was never even interviewed them. His lawyer contacted and said, my client has never been interviewed by anyone, and this is how important he is. And he wanted to be interviewed. It was like he's probably getting older. All right, they're investigating this thing again. It's time to get this thing out in the open. And the result was he ended up dying without ever giving a statement or doing anything. A witness this absolutely vital. That was critical.
It's interesting because the House investigation went to a lot of places that obviously the Warren Commission would not go to, but they had their limits.
they knew the places really to stay away from, and staying away from Dr. Berkeley was probably about the most important thing. He ended up dying, and the family researchers said, "Can we get permission of the family to contact this law firm in the lawyer's office that contacted the assassinations?" And they said no.
And he never made a personal statement, or did he?
Never made a statement. Never is on
Even
the
with an
record.
affidavit,
Nothing. Yep. And while they're getting the X-rays of Jack Ruby's, the dental X-rays of Jack Ruby's mother. I mean, it's one of those comical things, interviewing Lee Oswald, second grade teacher,
absolutely
but
ridiculous.
not interviewing the key critical eyewitnesses that were within 20, 30 feet of the shooting, and they were saying, yes, the shooting came from over there.
Unbelievable. It's just painful to hear all of this. I know we're probably going to have to wrap. You never wrote a book, but this feels like I just read your book.
Okay. It's
what about Richard Nixon? Was he in Dallas? I heard that he was. Is that coincidence, or was he part of any of this? I mean,
no.
At the time he had lost the election to Kennedy, he wasn't. He didn't hold any political office at the time.
Correct. He was in town for to speak at a Pepsi Cola convention of executives, and was there on. I think he was there November the 21st, and flew out the morning of the 22nd.
Oh, so he left before.
He actually left
Kennedy
before.
was in town.
Yeah.
So that sounds is that just a coincidence? It sounds like it could be.
I think it's a coincidence. Roger Stone said in his book, that's why Stone will not go anywhere that he doesn't have the permission of the or anything. He's very good. He said Nixon never told him. Stone would always try to bring up the topic with Nixon.
Sounds like Nixon, though, was connected to a lot of those Cubans. When he was vice president under Eisenhower, he was deeply involved in planning of the Bay of Pigs, which happened under Kennedy, but was planned under Eisenhower and Nixon. So a lot of those seem like Nixon's guys.
Right, yeah.
And he's there.
Yep.
For the morning, he leaves hours before it all happens.
And Nixon was in charge of a committee.
The 5440 committee. Wasn't that it, or am I getting my numbers?
This was going when he was in Congress going back in the 40s. He was in charge of a committee where an FBI document came out in 1948. An informant by the name of Jack Rubenstein was talking to him from Chicago.
To Nixon?
To Nixon's committee. So which is interesting that the FBI admits that was a mistake. That wasn't something that really should have been there in the file. They got caught, meaning they don't like to tell who the informants are, especially someone like that.
So we have Jack Ruby talking in 1948, basically of Nixon's people.
Yep. Which is stuff. But Nixon, nothing. I don't think he has any connection. He has now. Oh, he fully knows.
And of course, during the Watergate stuff, all those.
Right.
I mean, he clearly was talking about Kennedy hit and knew everything about it.
And on the Watergate tapes, at some point, he says the Warren report was the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on the American people. Is what he's got that
in there.
Yeah, in the Watergate tape. So he was full. I mean, he was fully aware. They were were all fully aware of what had happened. All of the top. Folks.
Really, what you're saying. I mean, all of the future American presidents after Kennedy, from Johnson and to Nixon and Ford, all of them. Nixon maybe not definitively connected to it, but certainly in the know. And he was you could argue Nixon was taken out in his own little coup, really, against him.
Exactly.
I mean, Watergate really, I think, arguably was a setup against him. Nixon, not that he was a clean president, all of these guys were engaged in criminal espionage against opponents and people. But I think Nixon just put himself in bad graces with his paymasters, that is the Rockefeller people, and what were then really the globalist crowd, what had become the global. I think that's what happened. And they took him out and they put their reliable player Ford in.
Exactly. Yeah. No. He was very reliable.
And I mean, was it you? Someone was just telling me that Spiro Agnew, his first vice president, who was, I mean, an utterly corrupt Maryland politician. How he got on the ticket, I actually would have no idea how that even happened, but was taken down because it was known that Nixon was going to be taken down. Does that?
I had not heard that.
Someone
I heard
someone
was saying that the other night at dinner. They brought
maybe
up
that's
Spiro
what it was.
Agnew.
I thought,
someone
wow,
brought that up, but
that's interesting.
Didn't know. But when you compare Nixon to Johnson, there's no.
Nixon was like a
comparison.
choir boy
He
compared
was
to Johnson.
Choir boy, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, not even close.
Yeah,
I think Johnson was probably certainly from what you described, the bloodiest-minded president in American history.
Absolutely,
and the most cold-blooded, vicious murderer.
Right. He was, as
he would have been a great
Roger Stone
mafia
said,
boss.
He was a functioning lunatic. What it was put. He was a very scary guy, and everyone knew he could not be crossed. And the Bobby Baker stuff that he said that came on, and it's still, though, it's amazing how years later people are still afraid to talk about some of the Johnson stuff. The Johnson family, with help from I think the Fords and stuff, shut down the History Channel really from showing the Bar McClellan story that I was telling you about.
Yes.
That, and really any of the really good JFK assassination things they used to put on there back 25 years ago, like The Men Who Killed Kennedy, a British production, and some very top flight films that were made about all of the stuff that I'm saying today. This stuff has been censored more in the last 20 years, and it's getting worse. They don't want anything being said out there about the Kennedy assassination, and the Warren Commission is the company line.
It's amazing. It's been almost 60, going on 60 years now, 56, 7 years.
Yep.
And one would have thought in any kind of normal world that by 50 years or more, all the players are dead. They're all gone.
Yep.
You think it would come out, but if it were to come out, it would implicate the current political structure, because there's been no house cleaning, and all of those people have left their own legacies. Right. Bush family, but even beyond that, it's the whole. If you start really looking into the truth of this hit on this murder, open in plain daylight murder of a U.S. president, that was even recorded, then a true analysis of that would obviously reflect on our society today, I think. And I just think that cannot be allowed.
It can't. It
cannot be permitted.
And you actually put it very well put then, right then, this out in the open murder of the president, that was a message to all of the other presidents coming.
That's right.
Of who's really in charge. And it's not them.
That's right.
It's not whoever takes
That's right.
the office. It was a message.
Yeah.
Because it was clearly out in the open, and that's the very scary thing, and all of them have been completely aware of that. That they know they can do various things, but they can only go so far.
We could do this for another hour easy. I could ask you about Bobby Kennedy. I'm sure you got thoughts about that.
Yes,
was
I do.
Johnson, real quick, was Johnson behind that?
The same players were involved with both.
So that would mean Johnson as well.
Yep.
I mean, in Bobby's case, he was, I mean, the obvious thing you look at is, well, if he were to become president, would that involve an investigation of his brother's murder?
Yeah.
That's one thing. Secondly, the whole Vietnam issue. Bobby Kennedy was the candidate who was like, "This is we're going to end this," just when they were trying to escalate, actually. So there was all of these reasons. He was just falling into the same. Right. What about Martin Luther King Jr.? Do you think this was
same players?
Johnson.
Right. Yeah. The House Assassinations Committee concluded he was killed as a result of a conspiracy.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep. And that was the same government players that were involved in that one. All three is of the same ilk. That was done. It was the same players, same time frame, and it's we could talk for quite a while on that, but there's no question the same power structure in the CIA. And the bad elements of the FBI, and there have always been bad elements of the FBI.
That concludes Part 6 of the JFK Sessions with researcher Phillip Lavelle, where we discussed the manipulation of the Zapruder film and the truly psychopathic nature of President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who clearly appears to have had a significant part to play in the assassination of President Kennedy. You know, it astonishes me, even now, after studying so much grisly and unappealing elements to the underside of our history, that this part of it continues to get swept away after so many years. In a logical and just world, that would never happen. Thanks for listening. Because of the nature of social media everywhere now, the presence of this and similar programs I've created are never secure. You never know when the hammer may come down. That's why I encourage you to visit my website, Richard Dolan Members, where I produce much more content like what you've just heard. Hope to see you there. Meanwhile, let's remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later.